President Trump and I agreed to pursue negotiations towards a deal within the coming 30 days.
Katie, what did Mark Carney need to accomplish here?
The simple answer is do no harm and really make sure that he doesn't have additional challenges to deal with that he didn't have before the summit started.
The G7 summit in Alberta ended without a joint statement. President Trump left early, and attention quickly shifted to other global flashpoints. But behind the scenes, Canada and the United States quietly agreed to a 30-day window to reach a new trade and security deal. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, it's a crucial opportunity to ease the pressure of U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. For the White House, it may be just another way to apply leverage. This deal is more than symbolic. It sets the stage for a fast-moving and high-stakes negotiation. Just before Trump's departure, he and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney agreed to a tight deadline: 30 days to finalize a new economic and security partnership. According to CBC News, Carney said the goal was to mitigate the damage from U.S. tariffs in exchange for cooperation on border security, fentanyl, and smuggling control. But here's the catch. While Canada is actively putting forward specific proposals, senior Canadian officials told Radio Canada that the U.S. has yet to offer anything in return. Carney himself admitted that having a deadline helps focus negotiations. But he also noted Canada won't wait forever. At this point, there is no signed agreement, no draft text, no mutual concessions on paper, just a handshake and a ticking clock.
In parallel, we must reinforce our strength at home and safeguard Canadian workers and businesses from the unjust U.S. tariffs that exist at present.
While waiting for Washington to respond, Canada has taken decisive action to shield its domestic steel and aluminum sectors. Prime Minister Carney announced a suite of countermeasures designed to both pressure the U.S. and stabilize Canada's internal market. One of the key actions is the planned adjustment of existing retaliatory tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum, set for July 21st, the end of the 30-day window. The level of adjustment will depend on the progress of negotiations. Canada is also tightening procurement rules. Only domestic producers and firms from countries with reciprocal trade agreements will be eligible to bid on federal infrastructure projects involving steel and aluminum. This effectively sidelines U.S. suppliers unless an agreement is reached. To prevent trade circumvention, Canada is introducing 100% tariff quotas on select steel imports from third countries. These measures aim to block cheap steel, often rerouted from countries like China, from undermining local production. The government has also established 2 new task forces, one for steel, one for aluminum, to monitor international trade trends and advise on rapid policy responses. Additionally, a 10 billion Canadian dollar loan facility has been made available to large domestic manufacturers to help maintain liquidity and production continuity. These actions signal that Canada is not just reacting to external pressure. It is actively building a defensive posture in anticipation of prolonged trade friction. As Canada prepares, the United States appears increasingly distracted. President Trump has returned to Washington to focus on escalating tensions in the Middle East, particularly the conflict between Iran and Israel. This shift in focus raises concern that the 30-day deadline could pass without meaningful engagement from the U.S. side. Meanwhile, Canadian steel-producing regions, especially in Ontario and Quebec, are watching nervously. The impact of a 50% U.S. steel tariff remains severe, and uncertainty about trade conditions only deepens the strain on workers and businesses. Mark Carney has emphasized the importance of resilience and forward planning, rather than relying on past frameworks or expectations. His government is treating the 30-day period not as a diplomatic formality, but as a critical economic pivot point.
I stress Canada's readiness to work to create new international partnerships to promote a world that's more secure, prosperous, just, and free.
This isn't just a negotiation, it's a stress test for Canada-US trade. Ottawa has put its proposals on the table and launched its own protections. Washington, for now, is keeping its options open. As July 21st approaches, time is running out. The outcome could define trade between the two countries for years to come.
Well, Tom, ever since President Trump left that G7 summit early to focus on the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, that has been the number one question.
At the White House, President Trump is weighing using U.S. aircraft and bombs to strike Iran's nuclear facilities.
One president left a summit, another capital caught fire. When President Trump walked out of the G7 meeting in Alberta, the world was focused on diplomacy. But over Tehran, the skies were already beginning to change. As Israel launched strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, Trump returned to Washington and posted a series of statements asserting that the United States had full control of Iran's airspace and knew the location of Iran's top leader. There was no formal declaration of war, no calls for peace either. Just a dangerous gray zone where the United States and China, each backing opposite sides, were quietly shaping the outcome of a war neither of them started. Shortly after Trump's departure from the G7, Israel carried out targeted strikes across Iranian territory, hitting nuclear and military facilities. Iran retaliated with missile launches toward Israeli cities. Most were intercepted, but several struck near Tel Aviv. Civilian evacuations began in Tehran as human rights groups reported hundreds of deaths and tens of thousands displaced. At the White House, Trump met with his national security team in a closed-door meeting. No formal statement followed, but online he demanded Iran's unconditional surrender and emphasized American surveillance dominance over the region. Though the U.S. had not officially entered the conflict, pressure was mounting. Lawmakers began calling for congressional oversight before any offensive actions could be ordered. In Europe, divisions emerged. France and Germany condemned Iran's response, but refrained from criticizing Israel's initial actions. Other Western leaders expressed concern that military escalation could spiral out of control. At the same time, several Arab states began urging for diplomatic resolution, warning of long-term regional instability. Neither Washington nor Beijing has signaled a desire for direct war. But the realities on the ground suggest otherwise. The U.S. has reportedly been supplying Israel with advanced military assistance, intelligence, aerial refueling capabilities, and potentially bunker-penetrating bombs needed to strike deeply buried Iranian facilities like Fordo. On the other side, China has stepped up diplomatic support for Iran, reinforcing trade links and coordinating with international bodies like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. Although both the U.S. and China officially deny involvement, the deepening support each side lends, military or diplomatic, is quietly shifting the balance. The conflict is beginning to resemble a proxy struggle, with strategic interests overshadowing direct confrontation.
China always try to solve the problems in the framework or under the framework of the United Nations.
China has now moved from silence to direct criticism. Beijing condemned the Israeli strikes, but its strongest words were reserved for Washington. Through its foreign ministry, China accused the United States of fueling the conflict, calling its actions reckless and warning that threats and military pressure would only worsen the situation. Without naming Donald Trump directly, Chinese officials described recent U.S. rhetoric as pouring oil on an already burning fire. This message was echoed by Chinese state media and diplomats speaking at international forums, framing Washington's posture not as peacekeeping, but as provocation. At the same time, China reaffirmed its support for diplomacy. It ruled out sending weapons to Iran and instead focused on pressuring global institutions to respond through legal and multilateral channels. Beijing's position remains clear. It will not intervene militarily, but it will resist any escalation that threatens regional stability. And it sees Trump's current posture as a dangerous accelerant. Donald Trump has positioned himself as both a deal-maker and a hawk. He claims to want a permanent resolution to the conflict, but his approach, grounded in military threat and diplomatic ambiguity, is creating more questions than answers. Meanwhile, China is working from the sidelines, shaping outcomes through diplomacy, economic influence, and quiet leverage. Neither nation has fired a shot, but both are already altering the course of the conflict. This is no longer just a regional dispute over missiles or nuclear enrichment. It is now a test of global power and a signal of how far two superpowers are willing to go without officially going to war.
To that, the G7 used to be the G8.
Well, I was flabbergasted, frankly, that he would start off his comments not about trade, not about the Middle East, but about Russia and the G8.
At the G7 summit in Alberta, Canada, President Trump once again showed why no one enters the room quite like he does. As global leaders gathered to discuss war, sanctions, and multilateral priorities, Trump turned the conversation upside down with just one remark. G7 used to be the G8, he said.
G8, Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in. And I would say that was a mistake, because I think you wouldn't have a war right now if you had Russia in. And you wouldn't have a war right now if Trump were president 4 years ago.
And with that, Trump wasn't just revisiting the past. He was proposing a new future, one that might include Russia, or even China. A G8, maybe a G9? For Trump, this isn't about sentiment, it's strategy. He sees the removal of Russia from the G8 in 2014 not just as a symbolic loss, but as a breakdown in communication. Without Putin at the table, there's no deal to be made, no leverage, and no channel to de-escalate the conflicts that have since followed.
Putin speaks to me, he doesn't speak to anybody else. He doesn't want to talk, because he was very insulted when he got thrown out of the G8.
Trump argues that by pushing Russia out, the West lost one of its few remaining diplomatic levers. He believes it pushed Moscow closer to Beijing, forming a bloc that now challenges US and Western influence from Ukraine to Iran. What he's proposing isn't a return to the old G8. It's a reconfiguration, a forum that's less about shared values and more about direct access. The G7 was designed to bring together advanced democracies. Shared principles, rule of law, liberal markets. Trump views that as limiting. In his calculus, you negotiate not with allies, but with adversaries. That's why he said he wouldn't mind if China joined. In his words, you want people you can talk to. This reflects a broader shift in Trump's worldview, from ideological consensus to transactional power politics. Sitting across from rivals, in his view, is not appeasement, it's a strategy. A way to strike deals on trade, on supply chains, on security, without having to conform to a common political doctrine. And it's no accident that these comments came after a private meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. While Carney focused on structure, institutions, and complexity, Trump made it simple. I'm a tariff person. He wants a platform where trade-offs can happen. Fast, clear, without endless communiques. That's the essence of his G8 or G9 vision.
Bad idea. I don't mind that. If somebody wants to suggest China coming in, I think we suggest. But you want to have people that you can talk to.
The potential impact of such a shift is significant. From Trump's perspective, the upsides are clear. It reopens diplomatic lines with Russia and possibly China, two powers central to most global flashpoints today. It gives the U.S. added weight in reshaping supply chains and trade terms, especially with energy and critical minerals in play. And it reinforces Trump's preference for bilateral leverage over multilateral consensus. But the risks are just as real. Many G7 members, especially in Europe and Japan, remain strongly opposed to inviting Russia back, let alone China. The G7 has been a bastion of democratic alignment. Opening its doors to different political ideology could fracture that core identity. It could also weaken initiatives on climate, technology standards, and human rights, areas where the West has tried to maintain a unified stance. And for allies like Ukraine or Taiwan, a diluted G7 raises new doubts. Can they count on the group for consistent backing if the table now includes their rivals? Trump's proposal may not gain traction this year, but it signals a fundamental rethinking of how America uses international forums. He doesn't want consensus. He wants negotiation. He doesn't want shared statements. He wants leverage. And if the G7 does become a G8 or even a G9, it won't be a reunion. It will be a reset, on Trump's terms.